Next up is Tega Brain, who's going to talk about the entropy of a system.
Oh, I think it'll be okay. We'll try. Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. I'm Tega. I'm an artist and environmental engineer, and I call what I do eccentric engineering. So I do experiments with data and technologies and computers that ask questions of how we design and engineer the systems within which we live. I'm particularly concerned with how to design from the dystopian position of the Anthropocene. How to make creative work that is simultaneously critical and generative. We're scrambling to figure out what it means to have moved an enormous amount of carbon from the ground into the atmosphere, largely via combustion. And so this talk considers some of my work dealing with environmental data and a changing climate, and hopefully points to some of what is at stake as we collectively face this. What does it mean to have augmented the atmosphere and the ocean, the atmosphere and ocean's capacity to absorb heat, and to be rapidly increasing the entropy of Earth's systems? The term entropy, of course, has two definitions, one in thermodynamics and one in information theory. So to start with the thermodynamic definition, entropy is the randomness of the constituents in a system. In other words, if you heat or increase the temperature of a gas, it increases its entropy, its randomness. And so what ways can we see this in our shared environmental systems? So first of all, we can look at the biological interfaces that surround us and how they change through time. So this is the study of phenology. Phenology is the timing of recurring biological events such as flowering and migratory patterns in different ecosystems. And it's of great interest of researchers because it's showing how the biosphere is changing with climate change. Observing phenology is to observe a complex, rhythmic and cyclical relationship between temperature and time. The oldest written biological data set on record is the cherry blossom bloom in Kyoto, Japan. This is of interest because it heralds the beginning of the Cherry Blossom Festival and has been pieced together since 1800 AD, looking from the records of emperors and aristocrats in Japanese history. So this has become an important climate record because the cherry blossom bloom starts after a series of warm days at the beginning of spring. And so it's very clear from looking at this record that the bloom is becoming happening sooner and sooner in the year as our Earth system is warming up. So looking at some of these phenology data sets is at the heart of this project, which was a collaborative project I did at the Environmental Health Clinic at NYU called the Phenology Clock. This is visualization software that visualizes phenology data from different ecosystems, and it produces 12-month clocks. So January is at the midday, the 12 o'clock mark, and each band of colour shows a flowering pattern from a particular species of plant, so it shows the duration of that flowering event. And what is revealed is temporal relationships within ecosystems. So you can see Sydney on the left, flowers all year round. New York on the right, like nothing happens for 6 months of the year, right? As an Australian, I'm horrified by this. So I've used this software to look at a number of phenology data sets from different places, and here is a clock generated from a family of eucalypt trees. And what's amazing about this image is you'll notice that there's always 5 or 6 species in flower at any one time. Why would this be? Why would a family of trees distribute themselves temporally throughout the year? The reason being is it's thought that they're co-evolved with this species, the flying fox. The flying fox is the dating service for the trees, it pollinates them, and the trees provide a food source. So by temporally distributing flowering patterns, this guy has a food source throughout the year. Plants mediate the atmosphere. Increasing entropy flows on to destabilise mutualistic relationships such as these. Increasing overall temperature increases the unpredictability of these species synchronicities. A project following this, also exploring phonology, was a project I did scraping the Flickr database, looking to see if I could see these patterns in messy crowdsourced data. The resultant images are made up of thousands of images that are tagged with particular species name and laid out according to timestamp. So January on the left, December on the right, and each band is a year. And here we can see a very clear southern hemisphere flowering pattern. This is the jacaranda, which is an Australian flower. But these images are largely made up of things that look like this, right? A Texan family goes into the field to be photographed with the bluebonnets because you're not allowed to pick them. So these images actually became, what stood out for me was they were about how we actually relate to these different species, how we see them and how we use a database such as Flickr. They're as much a result of like our social relationships with species as they are indexes of a changing environment. Environmental observation has, of course, become increasingly computational, and we no longer rely on direct observation of the biosphere to understand climate. Instead, we use a network of satellites, weather stations, data centres, and so forth to do this. We process unthinkable amounts of data, and our computational systems burn up millions of dollars of electricity every month to do this, producing enormous amounts of heat. The transfer of information cannot take place without a certain expenditure of energy, which is what Norbert Wiener said, the father of cybernetics. Processing data is never thermodynamically neutral. Any act of organising pushes against a tendency for everything to degrade, and cooling has always set the limits on computational design. Computation is about managing heat. It determines how densely components can be packed and where data centres are to be built. If you put them in the Arctic, it really reduces your energy costs. In other words, cyberspace is hot. Computing is an exothermic reaction. Of course, despite the overdue push to increase the use of renewables, data centres and computers are still run on coal and use Coltran. And they use somewhere between 1% to 3% of our electrical output, and this is rising. Every video, image, Google search we make has an environmental effect. Every computational automation, every machine learning innovation relies on combustion somewhere. Shouldn't these costs be considered in how we assess the success or failures of our computational systems? And how might we rethink our network interfaces to make these material costs more tangible? These questions are posed by a series of experimental Wi-Fi routers, eccentric Wi-Fi routers that I made in a series called Radiotropisms. This one, called Open Flame, is a router that is paired with a candle. To bring up the wireless network, you have to light the candle. When you blow it out, your network disappears. Wax is laid down over time, depending on your online life. Each Wi-Fi router also offers a network. Another one in the series, an orbit, oscillates its signal strength with the orbit of the moon. So for one day a month, you get really strong, great internet, and for one day a month, you get none. And it changes over a 28-day period. Again, how might we invite our environmental systems into our networks? Finally, this is a Wi-Fi router controlled by a house plant, and the plant is equipped with a camera. It can take photos of itself and replace images in your network feed. So any unencrypted data ends up with a photo of this plant. So these are provocations. How can design of our network interface emphasise our ecology rather than hide it behind seamless user interfaces? So to conclude, I want to return to this term entropy, but I want to consider it from the point of view of information theory. In information theory, entropy is a measure of the loss of information content in a signal or a system. A term developed by the father of information theory, Claude Shannon, to describe the probabilistic measure of uncertainty in a system. All right, so break it down. What does this mean? It's ambiguous. If we think about the entropy of a coin, we can get either a head or a tail when we toss it, right? This is known as one Shannon of entropy. If the coin was to have two heads on both sides, the entropy of the system is 0 because it's completely predictable what the outcome would be. If the coin was to have 3 or 4 or more faces, the amount of information contained into the system is greater, and so the entropy of the system is greater because it's harder to predict. The ultimate information science is meteorology, and the project of weather prediction is an ongoing attempt to lower the entropy of our weather system in an informational sense. We use data to build models to hopefully better predict the behaviour of our system. And as historians like Paul Edwards have shown, climate prediction is intimately tied with the development of planetary computation. Computer resources are always inefficient in meteorology, and it is the ultimate big data science. And to me, there's a sort of dark irony that we've built sophisticated global systems for collecting Earth and climate observations to predict climate at the very time where our collective impacts on human society are actively destabilising it. One consequence of this could be observed earlier this year at Oroville Dam in California, when the catchment received more than twice its annual rainfall last winter. As the emergency spillway was engaged for the first time in the 49-year life of the dam, it began to erode, the engineers became concerned, and 200,000 people were evacuated from the watershed with less than an hour's notice. Although the incident is indeed a failure in adequate engineering and maintenance of that spillway, to call it solely an engineering problem overlooks it also as being a climate problem. So a water engineer's job is to size stuff. The height of a dam, the size of a culvert, the depth of a drain. These things are sized to prevent flooding at certain storm intervals. You generally think about how big your catchment is upstream of the thing you're designing. You think about what sort of rain patterns are going to happen in that catchment and how frequently it's okay for it to flood. The best practice guidelines in stormwater modelling used to be to model 10 rainfall patterns for each thing you're designing. And just this year, this was upgraded to 20. So this is like doubling the amount of human labour and computational work that's going into modelling for these sorts of water infrastructures. So what's critical here is that at best we only have about 150 years of rainfall data, much less in some regions. And this has been taken from a stable, predictable climate. At the heart of this sort of engineering is an assumption that past rain is a good indication of future rainfall or future weather. What happened at Oroville is outside of what the historical data would have indicated could have happened. They got a lot more rain because their models said that this would fall as snow rather than rain in the catchment. And so calling Oroville an engineering failure is actually not accurate because it's also a failure in our ability to predict climate. So the work of a water engineer has become increasingly difficult as precipitation data drawn from a stable climate is becoming less and less indicative of things to come. And the stakes are high. If you look around, you'll notice that all of our infrastructures, our dams, our culverts, but also our media and computational technologies are specifically calibrated to stable conditions of the past 12,000 years. And climate change promises to decouple us and these systems from their climactic niches. Even with the rapid advance of computation, climate destabilising is increasing the entropy of our system and reducing our capacity to predict it. And with all of our technologies, we need to be considering their increasing energy demands and their climate affordances. Thank you. Okay, and next up we have Zara Rahman with Inform Transform.
Hi everyone. Oh, gosh, thank you. Cool. So I'll be talking about the importance of building bridges between researchers who are thinking critically about technology and data and civil society, so those working for positive social change. So I came to this fellowship wanting to explore the idea of tech translation, which is a term that a colleague and friend of mine, Lucy Chambers, coined a couple of years ago. I was using it very specifically to explain this observation that I kept seeing, that people who were working in technology, who had a really deep understanding of technology, were effectively speaking almost a different language to those outside of the tech sector. I spent some time in 2015 collecting a series of case studies around how civil society organizations, the challenges that they were facing when they were trying to engage with technology and data. And these ranged from not knowing how to manage data that they were collecting about vulnerable communities to building, to using resources to build an app that ended up to be kind of useless. So some context, I work for a nonprofit organization called the Engine Room. Our mission is to support civil society to use technology and data more effectively and strategically in their work. And when I say civil society, I mean journalists, media, activists, community organizers, nonprofit organizations. Some context about the situations in which we're working. It's often very resource limited. There's not that much money. There's a lot of pressure. And as you can imagine right now, it feels like the problems that we're trying to address are growing even bigger. And over the past couple of years, it feels like civil society has been almost overwhelmed with promises of how technology can suddenly magically solve the problems that we're trying to address. Some coming from tech giants who say they've developed some semblance of social conscience suddenly, some from startups who see a problem and think that technology can help without thinking about the systemic issues underlying it. And they come with money and resources and expertise. Compare that to the attitudes that we have here. So we are a group of people who are, at Data and Society and academics and researchers who are thinking deeply, critically about the role that technology and data is having in the world. Groups of academics from all sorts of disciplines are building up an ever-growing body of research around the social implications of technology, and we're not alone. We're learning from each other and the world around us, and we have the opportunity to spread our ideas. Ursula K Le Guin wrote in her book, The Dispossessed, the idea is like grass. It craves light, likes crowds, thrives on crossbreeding, and grows better for being stepped on. The concept of ideas improving with better diversity of people contributing is not new. So then my question becomes, in terms of tech criticism, who is contributing? As far as I can tell, by and large, it's not often activists or people working for positive social change explicitly. One potential explanation is written about in this post by Chris Olah and Shan Carter from Google Brain. They write about the idea of research debt, essentially the labor that a researcher needs to do in order to start contributing to a field. They need to first understand what's come before, climb this mountain of previous work. Then when they can contribute, they contribute by putting their work on top of this mountain, which makes the mountain higher for those who come after, and it makes it harder to climb. They use the term debt here to reflect that in the short term, though this might seem like a logical way to go about it, in the long term, it's not necessarily that logical or progressive or useful, really. Like technical debt for programmers, it's, again, a practice that seems logical in the short term, but might be problematic in the long term. I observed this debt a lot in the tech and social change space. Here, as I said, there are academics and researchers who are thinking deeply and critically about technology and data. In many civil society organizations, there are people implementing tech projects, working with existing platforms, who have no idea about the critiques that exist. And it's not that the people that in those spaces aren't critical thinkers. Everyone working in social justice work or social change or for social change, it's all about analyzing power and understanding people and politics and relationships. It's often the same, almost the same kind of set of skills, but it's very, there's a complete lack of exchange between these different spaces. I think this is problematic for a number of reasons. I'm just going to go into two of them here. Firstly, and none of this won't be new to many of you, the negative effects of technology are often first felt by those on the margins of society. This has been true throughout the history of colonialism, medical technologies, warfare technologies, anything. And it's crucial, so as a result, it's crucial that those working with marginalized communities or those members of those communities have the tools they need to be able to critically assess technologies. One example, one of the earliest uses of biometric technologies for identification was on Afghan refugees back in 2002. That's 15 years ago. They were crossing the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and it was by a UN refugee agency done in partnership with a tech company who was selling them this wonderful product that was going to solve all of their problems. Very little attention was paid at the time to the privacy rights of the refugees in question. The technologies were used on 4.2 million people across a period of 5 years. Before being used on those 5.2 million people, it had been tested on 300 people. From research carried out by Katja Jacobsen in 2010, there were many problems, as you can imagine. She documented them in a really nice research paper. This is just one quote from someone who ended up using and having to implement these technologies, saying, "Previously, you could doubt your own judgment before the machines. This iris recognition will make it much better. How can they argue now the machine can't make a mistake?" That initiative was probably, I have to imagine, implemented by people with the very best of intentions. They were working in the humanitarian sector. They probably went into this sector wanting to make people's lives better. To my mind, it's really clear that they were lacking, and often still are, a critical lens to view the technologies that they're being sold on and asked to use. Without tools to critically assess and think about the role of technology in society, I worry that civil society will end up perpetuating inequality rather than dismantling the power structures we seek to dismantle. The second reason I find this lack of exchange kind of problematic is that it's far easier to poke holes and find problems with projects and ideas and technologies than it is to build them. Sarah Watson talks about an evolution of tech criticism that she calls constructive tech criticism. In her words, it goes beyond intellectual arguments, it is embodied, practical, and accessible, and it offers frameworks for living with technology. That's exactly what people working in civil society and for positive social change are trying to do. We're engaging with the problems of society, we're trying to build better futures, and not just suggest alternative possibilities, but build them and make them happen. This is a massive challenge, obviously, that needs a diverse set of people and skills and perspectives. In addition to activists and practitioners and organizers, it needs constructive tech critics too. So how can we create these spaces for engagement? This would mean creating spaces for people from diverse backgrounds and experience to contribute to research meaningfully, not just being interviewees or participants in a research project, but being the people who design the project or carry out the research. But going back to what I said earlier about research debt, that path of engagement currently exists primarily by asking people who already carry a heavy burden to climb mountains rather than walk along bridges. When people working in civil society or people that I work with ask me, what should I read or what should I look at to help to try and understand these critical perspectives you talk about, I often actually don't know what to suggest. I know that they have, resource limitations, time pressure, it needs to be accessible, and I'm not really sure where those bridges are. So in response to this, and in response to seeing how quickly misinformation spread in 2016, I've been thinking a lot about different ways to communicate these ideas, not just in a way that tries to explain them as though I'm an expert explaining things to lay people, but in a way that encourages interrogation and encourages engagement and allows people to actually question what I'm saying. Together with my collaborator, Mimi, who's in the back, we developed this zine as a playful way of helping people think critically about the role of information in society. We wanted it to be familiar. It's a physical artifact. We wanted people to look at it and not think that we're experts telling them things, but think, hey, I could have probably done this myself too. So it's handwritten. We wanted to give context as to why this should matter, so each page has a historical example that speaks to the context of the people that are reading it. So we've translated it into German and replaced the examples with German examples, and we're doing the same for Spanish. We want to keep exploring this idea, so we've set up a studio, a small format, where for now at least you can buy the German and English versions of the zine. And we'll be using small format to continue to explore playful and critical printed interventions for exploring the data. So watch this space. In conclusion, I believe that the role of distilling complex ideas into their simplest forms is a task that the tech critic community could get a lot better at. We need to be able to explain complexity in simple ideas and explain ideas not by relying on knowledge of Western philosophers or theorists, but by situating it within local context and lived experience. last week at a conference that Ingrid hosted called Future Perfect, Ruha Benjamin talked about the value of creating knowledge, not to convince people who we want to impress or persuade of a certain thing, but for ourselves and for people who need it. I'd ask you all to think carefully about who you're producing your knowledge for and whether they're the ones that could benefit the most from it. Thank you. And now we have Ingrid with a talk that is not called Apocalypse Still Buffering.
Thanks, Zara. Yeah, hey, I changed the title, sorry. Oh, I think we have to change interfaces, okay. This is very exciting. Hi, everyone. Hi, where am I? Okay, so yeah, the title of this talk is Everybody Runs. So I am an artist and writer. This year, I've kind of been operating more, I guess, in a curatorial mode, more than kind of making a lot of new work. And this is partly because I've spent a lot of time being paralyzed by crippling anxiety and depression that makes it really hard to show up for myself. But another reason that I'm going to talk about, is this the right direction? Yeah. Is I've been thinking a lot about futures or the end of the world and different ways that people manifest futures and visions of the world and the world to come and how that shapes the way that we live in the world now and the ways we think about, in particular, technology. And I don't know, personally, like I think it's kind of more useful to get a bunch of different futures on the table and look at different practices and approaches than be like, what do I think about this, right? So a lot of what this is manifested at is kind of doing events and kind of gathering texts and putting people in a room. So this year I was running Data and Society's speculative fiction reading group, which was like a super fun way to get people working on different subjects all together. This was the title card from a panel I organized for Theorizing the Web called Apocalypse Buffering, in which I had three of my favorite people, Jade Davis, Damian Williams, and Tim Bond. Jade and Tim are here. I'm sad Damian's somewhere in Atlanta. But I had asked them to write speculative dystopian fiction in the form of slide lectures for an academic conference. It was really fun. And this is a slide from a conference that I hosted here last week called Future Perfect. All of the talks are online. It was really delightful, actually. We got a good group of weirdos in the room. This is from the second panel. But so one of the reasons that I guess I've been doing work like this, I've been trying to get as many weird futures on the table as possible, is because the truth is there are these sort of ubiquitous futures, right? Ideas about how the world should or will be that have become this sort of mainstream dominating vernacular that's primarily kind of about a very white, Western, masculine vision of the future, and they've kind of colonized the ability to think about and imagine technology in the future, right? This year actually is funny for having a lot of kind of auspicious anniversaries in this genre. So the iPhone is 10 years old. And it's not technically a work of speculative fiction, but I think of it as sort of an object that's sort of foreclosed on a certain kind of futurity. This is a real thing that Steve Jobs said when he introduced the world to the iPhone. Snow Crash is 25 years old, Neil Stephenson's landmark bro sci-fi novel. And while Mark Zuckerberg apparently no longer makes the novel Snow Crash mandatory reading for new Facebook employees, which was something that was written about in 2014, he's still, very happy to co-sign on making the metaverse a reality with this turgid white supremacist shit poster. Palmer Luckey? Yeah. Horrible man. Anyway. I only have 10 minutes, and I'm at the end, and you guys will probably want to get a drink. So I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about a particular case study of an artifact of this sort of dominant future vernacular that whose auspicious sort of anniversary of coming into the world happens to be today. So on June 21st, 2002, 15 years ago today, Steven Spielberg's Minority Report was released in theaters, and with it, mass media depictions of the future were kind of indelibly transformed. And I don't really want to talk to you about what Minority Report got right and what it didn't get right, because the where's my jetpack conversation is not particularly interesting. This is also true, though. I think that what I'm more kind of interested in is what made that future desirable, and maybe why it kind of has persisted as something that's desirable. These are just some gifs from some kind of corporate future concept videos. You can find a lot of these on YouTube. And where like it's become, like it remains this kind of point of reference for a lot of corporations and PR flacks, while simultaneously for many others being seen as sort of this neoliberal dystopia or bane of a graphic designer's existence. So sorry, just for some context, how many people are familiar with the film Minority Report? How many people have seen it in the last 30 days? Okay, cool, right, yeah. So anecdotally, and if anyone is, has an opinion on this, please correct me. In my experience of kind of talking to people, especially people who work in the spaces of policy and technology and society, who often complain about this film as this kind of like knee-jerk referencing of the future, is that while like most people can remember kind of the aesthetics and the interfaces and sort of the like vibe of the film, like there isn't really a single line of dialogue or like most of the basic plot premise that really completely translates. And this could be because, the dialogue includes such gems as, look, I'm not with the ACLU on this, Jeff. Or, in the milk, all they see is the future. It's not my favorite part of it. I can't believe that's not like a constantly quoted line. But I also think there's something very deliberate about that. Like the priorities that Spielberg himself put into making this film and the world building process that he used was in some ways very much deliberately about kind of foregrounding aesthetics, foregrounding tech, foregrounding kind of a vision of a society, of a technocratic society, more than any of the like kind of policy concerns. And I think that a lot of these works that are kind of one person's dystopia and another person's product roadmap have this quality. They foreground the like kind of premise over political economy. This is from a really good 2012 Wired piece where some journalists went and interviewed all of the consultants who worked on the film. And I don't know how many people know this story. Back in the day, Steven Spielberg had all these technologists and futurists and people from MIT and stuff into like some hotel in Malibu for a weekend and was like, tell me what the future's gonna look like. And this was people like Stuart Brand and Jaron Lanier, Douglas Coupland was there. Like, it's kind of this like a bunch of like TED Talk type guys. We're all designing the future. And some of this was based on, the work that they do as consultants, kind of like forecasting what they could imagine based on real technologies. Some of it was like blatant product placement. Lanier himself like was working on stuff related to the Kinect around the same time. He brought prototypes to the meeting. I also like blaming him for things. Maybe it's unfair. But this is a quote. I'm not going to read the entire thing to you, but I'll try to get through some of it from that particular oral history that I think a lot about. Stephen and I talked specifically about creating a new set of vernacular images of the future. I don't know why they had such a problem with like images of the future looking like Blade Runner, but whatever, that's your call. But so that, like, again, the point being like the amazing vision of the future was kind of more important than necessarily the political implications of it. And to his credit, like Spielberg made some kind of statements about this. This is way too long to read to you. This is from like a 2002 sort of like puff piece in advance of the film, where he's talking about the sort of civil liberty implications, but he also says in it, like, I'm on the president's side in this instance. I'm willing to give up some of my personal freedoms. It's kind of important to think about the fact this was also the first major kind of summer blockbuster after 9/11, right? This is kind of the tone in which this technology is being presented to people. And I think, it's nice that he's sort of thinking about it, but like ultimately what ends the pre-crime program in the film, spoiler alert, isn't like a realization of like the gross violations of civil liberties or just the fact that like it's kind of just a messed up concept. But what ends it is that they learned that the head of the pre-crime program murdered a lady and that he found kind of a flaw in the larger system that was able to let him get away with it. So it's like a technical shortcoming that means that the system might not always work. That's what actually ends pre-crime. It's not actually like a discussion of whether or not it was a good idea. So again, like there's a lot of energy put into kind of the world building of the film, but like the narrative arc is kind of just a means to an end to that world building in a lot of ways. And I think, there's not a lot of real emotional investment in the parts about like Tom Cruise mourning his son, and there's not a lot of context given to, I think, what is actually kind of the biggest plot hole of the film, and I apologize in advance because I told you I wasn't going to say what it got right and what it didn't, but I do think this is actually kind of relevant. Like, so the entire like driving concern of the movie is this shift where the pre-crime program, which starts as like a DC Metro crime prevention strategy, is going to go national. And there's never an explanation given as to what going national means, because at the end of the day, the pre-crime program is these three like children of drug addicts who have had mutations in their brain made them psychic to see into the future, who can only work together when they float in a pool where all they see is the future. So like, are they gonna like have to see everything in the country now? Are there more people like them? Does every city get a pool? Like, this is never explained. And this, like, what happens if one of them dies? Like it's the most logistically improbable product scaling plan I've ever seen. And again, this is what the film really got right, because at the end of the day, this is a world in which state-of-the-art technology ultimately depends on and bottoms out in the exploitation and emotional labor of a small group of people who are ultimately already at the starting, like at the bottom rung of society, right? Like they spend their entire lives being sedated through the process of constant exposure to traumatizing images and data in the service ostensibly of maintaining the peace, but also kind of acting as pawns in the establishment of this kind of super fucked up world order of perpetual surveillance. And, you know, that's one way of talking about content moderation. And that's one way of talking about what the gig economy does to consumers who ride in ride-sharing vehicles. And that's one way of talking about what it's like when I open a browser tab. And all of this is kind of to say that, like, what makes like kind of cyberpunk, why dystopia, your product blueprint future is so enduring is that erasure and undermining of the actual work and pain that goes into building those worlds, right? These worlds are kind of designed to make pain into somebody else's problem. And I think that, the gestures towards what's fundamentally fucked up about it in a lot of this kind of like dominant cinema and language is just that, it's a gesture. And ultimately, kind of what happens to the rest of society isn't that important until like it makes Tom Cruise, a cop, have a hard day. And I think, trying to own the future through affect, through devices, through aesthetics with this sort of vague dismissal of, or lack of comprehension of like policies, societal structures, and who ultimately kind of like bears the burden is kind of a piece of a larger, more kind of like ominous world building that I feel like is part of the world we are living in today, right? There's like a longer thing about prepper culture that I was going to talk about, but we're definitely out of time. Ultimately, I mean, it's a vision of the world where everybody runs, everybody runs was the tagline of the film. I think I neglected to mention that. I would have been surprised if any of you remembered that detail. But yeah, this is a world in which everybody runs from accountability and from culpability and from obligation to other human beings. And I honestly can't think of anything that's kind of more emblematic of the American dream in a weird way. But so, I don't know, I'm running out of time, and I don't have great answers of what it takes to change or resist these futures, these hegemonic futures. I mean, currently the recommendations I've got are more futures, right? Like more narratives, more kind of gathering, more discourse, more worlds, more care, more humanity, and like probably less white men. Thank you. This is also the best scene in the...
So since that was tremendously uplifting, I realized that we don't actually have time for questions because there's so many interesting conversations to be had. But the nice thing is that all four of them are going to be staying around afterwards. And as I promised, there is food, but more importantly, there is drinks. And drinks will actually help you think about the various futures, both positive and negative, that we have actually sort of been exposed to. Couple of little wrap-up pieces. Having socialized drinks activities, that's not actually that much fun with all of these chairs. So